Good morning, Southfield Christian Fellowship. So good to be with you on this Mother's Day 2020. I pray that your day is going as good for you this morning as is what it is here in the Barbee household. Thank you for joining us for our time in the Word this morning. Thank you for Jacob and others who are leading us in worship, and for just, again, the opportunity for us to gather together on this Lord's Day. Today, I have a special joy as a pastor. One of the things that I enjoy about being a pastor and being a preacher is being able to see the intersection between God's Word and life's events. And today, with this being Mother's Day, we're going to be looking in 1 Samuel chapter 1. And so for those of you who are familiar with the story, you know that this is the story of Hannah desiring to have a child, desiring to have a son, and her great bold request that she made of God and God's answer to that prayer. This is especially significant for me today for a couple of reasons. For those of you who know us, you know that this week that we have been grateful to God for the addition of a new grandson to our family. And so even as Hannah prayed for her son before he was even conceived, we've been praying for our grandson during the time of our daughter's pregnancy and praying for a healthy pregnancy and a safe arrival. And we're very glad that that has taken place this week. The other reason why this is a significant time for us, for Kara and I, is that this passage is one of those life passages that God has worked into our life through a series of events, and we're going to share a little bit more about that with you as we progress along in today's time in the Word. But what we're going to do today is we're going to work our way through 1 Samuel, at least chapter 1, and we're going to look at it in three parts. If you're taking notes, these notes will be published later on today, but our format is going to be, we're going to look at Hannah's torment, the fact of the anguish that she was in because she did not have a child, and her husband's other wife had lots of children. We're going to take a look at Hannah's prayer, at this great big bold prayer that Hannah prayed to God in asking for a son, and all that went into that prayer. And then we're going to finish it out by looking at Hannah's obedience. What happened after God granted the answer to that prayer and actually gave her the son that she had asked for. With this being Mother's Day, it's appropriate that we're addressing this to mothers, but husbands, dads, I want you to hang on with us as well, because we're going to be talking to you as well in what we're looking at today. So the takeaway that we have for you this morning is this: prayer is the parenting skill you never outgrow. Prayer is the parenting skill you never outgrow. One of the things that I do when I'm praying for my family on a regular basis is I've broken some of the different categories and the ways in which I pray for my children down, and I've written some statements and put them in my prayer notebook. And when I'm praying for my children, for my son and daughters, and for their spouses, I have a reminder on that particular page in my prayer notebook. And that reminder is to tell me that the way in which I am parenting my children now, one is I accept the fact that I am parenting my children still, even though none of them are living at home, but I'm parenting them through prayer now. And so I'm very grateful that God had taught Kara and I this a long time ago, and it continues to be true for us today. Our key verse today is going to be chapter 1, verse 11, but we're going to cover other verses before that and after that. And the reason that we're going to do that is this particular prayer that Hannah offers is offered in the context of what she was going through. And then God gave her a specific answer to her prayer. Whenever we are beseeching God because of we need to see His hand, we need to see His face, we're asking for Him to request to grant a request of ours, it always takes place in a particular context. And what I want us to learn how to do is to look at that context and to be able to see God even in the middle of all of the context, even if our set of circumstances don't look exactly like they did for Hannah. Let's begin now by reading verses 1 through 8 in 1 Samuel chapter 1, and then we'll go into our message. Beginning in verse 1, we read this: There was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephrathite. He had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now this man used to go up year by year from his city to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests of the Lord. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife, and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion, because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. And her rival used to provoke her grievously to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. So it went on year by year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. And Elkanah her husband said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? One of the first things that I want us to look at this morning is the fact that Hannah was barren. You know, when we were going through the book of Acts, we talked about the fact that many times in that book, Luke advances the action through what seems to be really long sermons and really long speeches, and where there's not a whole lot of action that's taking place. Well, the same thing is taking place here in the overall gospel story, in the story of the Bible. The Bible is moved along, the gospel story is moved along through these stories of barren women. You know, already in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, we know that we've covered the stories of Sarah, and we've covered the barrenness of Rebekah, and the issues between Leah and Rachel, and the mother of Samson. And today we come to the story of Hannah. You know, Hannah is a worthy name. The name Hannah means grace or gracefulness. It's a name, it's a beautiful name, and everything that we see in this story tells us that it accurately describes the character of Hannah. No wonder so many parents wish to name one of their daughters Hannah. It's a great name to give a daughter. The name of the other woman in the story, Peninnah, it also is a beautiful name. It means coral. Unfortunately, Peninnah's character did not match up to the beauty of her name. You see, the issue that we see in verses 1 through 4 is that Hannah is barren, but Peninnah is fertile. Peninnah has multiple sons and daughters. And our author tells us that what's going on in this situation is the fact that God has closed Hannah's womb. She is barren, and Peninnah is taking advantage of all of that. And in fact, the Hebrew tells us that Peninnah did this in such a way that she really magnified how mean that she was to Hannah in all of this. We're reminded in Scripture that with all of our scientific understanding, with all of our medical knowledge, that it is still God who grants birth. It is still God who determines the number of children that we have. And in the middle of these circumstances, we could, if we were Hannah, if we were in her position, we could say, why is God doing this? Why am I lacking? And we know from our story that the reason is because God is going to display his greatness through the story of Hannah. So every year when it was time to go up and offer sacrifices at Shiloh, Elkanah would give a portion to Peninnah and to her sons and daughters, to all of her sons and daughters. So we know again that Peninnah not only had a child, but she had many children, and she had many of both sexes. And she would use this as an opportunity when she would provoke Hannah. You know, some people could look at this and they would say, well, you know, here you've got rivalry between these 2 wives. If there was a rivalry between these 2 wives, the rivalry only was from Peninnah directed toward Hannah. Hannah was not trying to match what Peninnah had done. She was just simply trying to do that which she felt like would make her whole. This is a good illustration of why God has not intended for there to be multiple spouses in a marriage. You know, one of the things that we see in the Old Testament at this time there's no prohibition, or there's not any kind of negative admonition made in our story about the fact that Elkanah had multiple wives. But if we go back to what we saw in the Garden of Eden when God created Adam and Eve, we see that God's intention has been that a man would have a wife, that a woman would have one husband. I remember in my ethics classes in seminary, Dr. Ebby Smith, who used to quote this little formula. It was the first time I'd ever heard it quoted, but it was certainly the way in which I was raised. And the quote is this. He says, God's intention is for there to be one man and one woman and a one flesh relationship for life. So the presence of this rival inside of this marriage brings about a great deal of wrath and a great deal of bitterness and a great deal of anxiety in Hannah's life. But as evil and as nasty as what Peninnah was, Hannah is married to a good name, Elkanah. Elkanah's name points back to the Levitical roots of his birth. Elkanah's name means the man whom God has bought or acquired. And we see in these first 8 verses what Elkanah is doing that shows him to be a man of integrity and to be a man who loves Hannah. First of all, we see that he is a God-focused man. Every year when it's time to go up and offer the sacrifices at Shiloh, he is faithful to do that. And what's interesting here in our passage here is we're told that it's at this time that Hophni and Phinehas, the sons of Eli, are the ones who are the priests at Shiloh, but yet it's Eli who Hannah interacts with. If we read a little further into chapter 2 of this book, we'll see something about what's going on in the lives of Hophni and Phinehas. They are not godly men. They are not men who are to be held up as examples. They're men who are driven by unbridled appetites for food and for sex. They routinely flout God's calls for holiness and desiring the best parts of meat rather than the way God intended for them to be fed. And they openly sleep with women in the temple in violation of God's standards of holiness and purity and righteousness. And as I'm looking at that and as I'm meditating upon that, I'm just thinking about how even in the middle of all of this flagrant immorality that is taking place, God is building a story of beauty. He is building a story that is going to bring him great glory. Our passage tells us that when Elkanah would take his family to Shiloh to offer the sacrifice, he would give the portion to Peninnah and to her sons and to her daughters that they were to sacrifice. But to Hannah he would give a double portion. And in doing so, this was his way of saying, Hannah, I love you as if you had given me a son. I love you for who you are. And then later on we see that when he is trying to communicate with his wife and he's trying to console her and cause her not to weep or to be bitter, he says, Hannah, am I not worth more to you than 10 sons? This is a Hebrew saying that basically it's not strictly talking about the number 10, but it is talking about the how large the love is that Elkanah has for his sons. We use a phrase now that basically says, I love you to the moon and back. Now, the moon is roughly 238,855 miles from Earth, or about the distance of 30 Earths, stacked one side by side all the way. When we say I love you to the moon and back, we're not saying that I love you 238,855 times 2. What we're trying to communicate to somebody is there is no limit to how much I love you. And so this is what we see in this relationship between Elkanah and Hannah. Hannah is very blessed. She has a husband who loves her. He is a faithful man. He is a verbal man. And the way in which he expresses his love is very unusual for that day, very unusual for that culture. And in fact, he is extravagant in the way in which he expresses his love to his wife. He values Hannah for who she is, even when she hasn't had children. As I think about this, I'm thinking about what we see in the story of the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15. You know that story. You know that the prodigal son goes to his father and demands his inheritance, and then goes to a far country and wastes it in unrighteous living. And we see the father who is anxiously awaiting for his son to return. And we consider all of the aspects of that story, and we see a picture of God there in the father who grants his son's request, knowing what his son's going to do, knowing that his son is going to go and to waste his inheritance and do harmful things for his life, but who is anxiously waiting for his son's return. And when he sees his son coming home, he tosses aside all dignity that could be his. He gathers up his robes and he runs. He runs to embrace his son who's returning home. We see the same thing here in this story with Hannah and Elkanah. Elkanah is just a picture, again, he's Hannah's husband, but he's a picture to us of what Jesus is like and where Jesus is, and whatever the difficulty it is that you may be facing on this Mother's Day. He is with you. He is loving you. He is speaking to you from His Word. He is being extravagant in His love for you. So the first thing that I would like to stop and bring to your attention as we look at this torment that Hannah is going through is, wives, I want you to consider the role of your husbands in whatever this is that you're facing today, that you're wanting to pray about. I want you to consider what God has given you in your husband. I want you to see your husband as your ally. I want you to think well of him. I want you to accept the sometimes clumsy ways in which he tries to love you. I want you to encourage him to know how you need to be loved in the way that will minister to you. But I want you to be gracious to him. Husbands, I want you to treasure your wife for who she is. Elkanah loved Hannah even though she had not given him a son. He loved her with no reservations. If she died and never gave him a son, Elkanah was going to love her. Husbands, I want you to love your wives today for who she is, not for who she used to be, not for what you hope she will be someday, but love her today. And today especially, take the initiative to express your love to your wife. This is all the background that leads us into this time of Hannah's great request that she makes before God. And we pick that part of the story up here in verse 9. Our author says, beginning in verse 9, he says that after they had eaten and drunk in Shiloh, Hannah rose. Now, Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. As she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was speaking in her heart, only her lips moved, and her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli took her to be a drunken woman. And Eli said to her, How long will you go on being drunk? Put your wine away from you. But Hannah answered, No, my lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for all along I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation. Then Eli answered, Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him. And she said, Let your servant find favor in your eyes. Then the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. We come now to the second part of our sermon, to Hannah's prayer. And the first thing that I want us to see here in verses 9 and 10 is that in the middle of her distress, Hannah takes her distress to God. She doesn't blame anybody. She doesn't blame Elkanah. You know, in the story of Rachel and Jacob, I believe there's a time in that story when Rachel goes to Jacob and she blames him for her inability to bear children when it's God who has closed her womb. We don't see this happening with Hannah in today's passage. Instead of blaming her husband, she takes her distress to God. But as she is doing this, as she is in the midst of all of this emotion, she is just expressing herself with great thoughts to the Lord. And what Eli sees is he sees this woman who is in the throes of this anguish, and he hears things, and he looks, and what Hannah is doing is she is praying to the Lord, and the Hebrew literally says that her words are coming out of her mouth crowded together. In other words, they're all in a jumble. She may not know exactly what it is that she's saying. It may take her a while that she's praying before she gathers what it is that she's saying. But from where Eli was sitting, it looked like she was drunk. And Hannah then offers this great prayer that we see here in verse 11. And there are a few things that I want you to see here in the structure of this prayer that Hannah offers before the Lord that I want us to dwell on just for a few moments. The first thing that we see is that Hannah addressed God as the Lord of hosts. O Lord of hosts. And in doing so, what she is doing is something that we've been practicing doing at Southfield Christian Fellowship for a few years now. That when we begin our prayers, we don't just immediately jump into whatever our intercession is. She's beginning with worship. And this way in which she is praying, she is acknowledging that God is other than she is. She's putting herself in a position that is subservient to him. And she is saying to him, I am in a position where the only thing that I can do is I can request. I can't demand. So she begins her prayer by addressing God as the Lord of hosts. The second step that she takes in verse 11 is she draws attention to her affliction. And the way in which she just simply says, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant. And again, she's asking, she's not demanding. But why are we told that she says, will you indeed look on the affliction of your servant? What she's doing is she's being honest with God. She is saying, here's what's going on in my life. Here's what I would like to change. You know, we could rightly ask the question and say, well, doesn't God already know? He does. He does. But what he's looking for is he's looking for an honest relationship with us. And so when Hannah says, look on my affliction, she is saying, look at the details of my life. There's not a detail of our life that we can hide from God. Even if we have the wrong attitude, even if we have the wrong values and priorities, even if our requests were selfish, God already knows that. But he wants us to be honest with him and to have that kind of an honest relationship. But also, when she is talking about the affliction that is in her life, she is talking about the fact that she's in a situation that she can't change. I've often thought about the children of Israel when God led them out of Egypt and led them into the desert. And I've often thought about what would have happened if the children of Israel, in the midst of the Exodus, if they had said, you know what, I'm getting kind of tired of this manna. I think we're just gonna stop here and we're gonna grow our own food. And the thought would be, how in the world would you provide for yourself in the desert? You can't. The only way that you're going to come out of this desert is you're going to have to follow the God who brought you into the desert. What Hannah is doing with her affliction is she is just simply saying, here are my insurmountable difficulties that I can't fix and I can't change. And then she does something else. And she still hasn't noticed. She still hasn't gotten to her petition. She asks God not to forget her. Look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant. Do we have to remind God to love us? Do we have to remind God to keep his eye on us? No, we don't. We see a great picture of this in Exodus chapter 2. After the death of Joseph, when the children of Israel are growing in number and power, and Pharaoh is becoming very worried about the influence that they're having, and he begins to enslave the children of Israel. We're told in Exodus chapter 2, verses 23 and 25, it says that during these many days the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. God is not in danger of forgetting us. We don't have to remember. We don't have to remind him to remember us. So why is Hannah doing this? Why is this part of her prayer? I think it's wrapped up in something that we've been practicing for some time now, and that is the use of God's word in our prayers. When Hannah says, Lord, do not forget me, the way in which we mimic this in our prayers is we go to God's word and we find what he has already said regarding the situation that we are seeing, and we, quote unquote, remind him of what our request is. It's not that God needs to be reminded, but it is that we need to be reminded. We need to be reminded what God has already said about our situation. And that also is something that Hannah is modeling for us here. So Hannah has addressed God as the Lord of hosts. She has been very honest with God about the affliction of her life and where she is right now. And she's asked God to remember her, not to forget her. And finally, we get to her bold petition. Do you see that her request of God is not the first thing that she asked? It wasn't the second thing. It wasn't the third thing. She doesn't get to her bold request until the fourth thing, after she has acknowledged who God is, acknowledged his sovereignty over her life, after she has been honest with him about the situation that she is facing, after she has reminded him of what he has already promised. Then she says, God, I ask you for this. Remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son. What a bold request. Hannah did not ask God for a child. Hannah asked God for a son. And a lot of times we feel kind of awkward in asking God and being bold in the prayers that we ask for God. And a lot of times, we do need to be very careful that we're praying according to God's will. And we want to be very careful that we're not just putting something out there in kind of a name and claim it style, thinking that God is obligated then to give us anything that we ask for in the name of Jesus. But when you and I have gone to the Word, and we're certain what God is wanting to do according to his word, we need to ask boldly for him to request what he has already promised to do, that which is already in line with his word. She said, God, give me a son. And then she says, here's what I'm going to do. And she says that there are two things that she is committing herself to do before she even knows that she has conceived. She is going to offer him up to the Lord. She is going to give him up to the Lord to be a priest before the Lord all the days of his life. Now, Elkanah was of the tribe of Levi. He was a Levite, and this, which is the priestly tribe in Israel. But typically, the Levitical priest only served for 25 years, between the ages of 25 and 50. We have every reason to believe that Hannah offered up Samuel to Eli when he was 3 years old, when he was weaned from Hannah's breast. And the other thing so what Hannah is doing is she's going above and beyond even before she knows anything about this child that she'll give birth to, she's going above and beyond that, committing him to the Lord. And the second thing is she is saying to God is, she says, and no razor will ever touch his head. In other words, Samuel would be raised as a Nazirite. And again, what we see in the life of Hannah and in what she is promising with Samuel is that she's going above and beyond that which is called for. Typically, when one was called to be a Nazirite, or when one took the vow of a Nazirite, it was for a short season. It was for a short period of time until a particular vow had been fulfilled. But what Hannah is doing with Samuel is she says, I will give him to the Lord to be a priest before him all the days of his life, and he'll be a Nazirite all the days of his life. And think about what Hannah is doing. Before she ever has the son, she is telling God, God, if you will answer this prayer, I will not keep that son. If you will answer this prayer, then I will give him back to you. Such a bold prayer. What I'd like for you to think about as we meditate here is I would like for you to think about what it is that is causing you torment in your life today on this Mother's Day. And I want you to use whatever your torment is as your motivation to seek God rather than to blame others. It may be that your torment is a sense of barrenness in your life, even as it was with Hannah. It may be that you may see a sense of rebellion in your children. You've raised them to honor the Lord, and they don't want to. It may be that there's a sense of apathy, that your children are not outrightly rebellious, but they're just not concerned about the things of God. It may be that there are other issues that are taking place in the lives of your children. I want you to think about how God is using the context of that situation, of that set of pressures, and to do with it exactly what Hannah did. Use that as your motivation to seek the Lord. And then in whatever the situation is, I want you to embrace the reality that parenting is a walk of faith. No matter how good your kids may be or not be, every parent, every mother has to walk by faith. You know, with the birth of our grandson this week, one of the things that's been fun is we've been able to see him. And we were at their house one night this week, and my daughter had him wrapped up in the sling, and we were getting supper on the table and just enjoying visiting. And I was standing there looking at the 3D sonogram pictures that are on the side of the refrigerator. And I asked her, I said, hey, let me ask you this. Does your son look like any of these sonograms? And the answer is, well, of course he's going to. She immediately said, here are the two, or here are the three that are exactly how he looks. And the sonograms that were taken in the womb. You know, we're so grateful today that we have the technology that allows us to see these pictures of our children and our grandchildren before they're born. And it's fantastic. But keep in mind, God is not looking at an unfinished photograph. God is not looking at our children in the womb wishing that he could get a better look at them. God is seeing the video. He is seeing the beginning of their life, and he's seeing the end of their life. He's seeing it in its entirety from beginning to end. Commit yourself to walking by faith and walking in such a way that you are offering your child up to be the person that God wants that child to be. Here at the end of chapter 1, we see what happened after Hannah had that interaction with Eli. And beginning in verse 19, it says, they rose early in the morning and worshiped before the Lord. Then they went back to their house at Ramah. And Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. And in due time Hannah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Samuel, for she said, I have asked for him from the Lord. The man Elkanah and all his house went up to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and to pay his vow. But Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, As soon as the child is weaned, I will bring him, so that he may appear in the presence of the Lord and dwell there forever." Elkanah, her husband, said to her, "Do what seems best to you. Wait until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord establish his word." So the woman remained and nursed her son until she weaned him. And when she had weaned him, she took him up with her, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and she brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. And the child was young. Then they slaughtered the bull, and they brought the child to Eli. And she said, "Oh, my Lord, as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who was standing here in your presence, praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition that I made to him. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord." And he worshiped the Lord there. What we see here is one of the joys that Hannah had, even though Eli had given Samuel to the Lord even before he had been conceived, is that God allowed Hannah to experience what she wanted to experience. God answered her prayer. He opened up her womb, and he allowed Hannah and Elkanah to conceive a son. When she gave birth to Samuel, she then named him in light of the request. This is what the name Samuel means. It means that God has remembered me. God has remembered my prayer. And we see that all over this, we see the fact that Hannah has made this bold request to the Lord, and she has taken her hands off of this, and there's not any thought that she's going to take back what she told God that she was going to do. And when it was time, probably at the age of 3, after Samuel was weaned, she took Samuel to Eli. And when she gave him to Eli, she released him gladly. We don't have any hint that she regretted what she was doing. And then she reminded Eli of her original vow. So it's almost as if at the time that God had answered the prayer, she went back to that first prayer, to those first thoughts that she had, and she recommitted herself to what she had originally asked of God. A great pair of bookends to the story. I'm going to let Kara come now and share with you how this story is something that is significant in the life of our family.
Hello, Southfield. I really am glad today to share this story with you because it's such a significant part of my spiritual journey. And so, of course, I'm going to cry because I'm married to Alan and I'm me. But it kind of starts in December of 1986. Alan and I lost a baby very early in our first pregnancy. And, that's always a blow. You don't expect it. And it's often kind of the last thing you've thought about happening. And so, but through those first days, our sweet friends and family and even our doctor were very instrumental in just kind of getting us through that time. But Alan was scheduled to go on a ski trip with a college group that we worked with, and I had not been planning to go because I was pregnant, and the couple that worked was kind of in charge of that group encouraged me to go with them. And Cindy said, it's going to be good to get away. Even if you don't ski, you can have some time with the Lord and some time with Alan and some time to heal. And so I went. And I was, by this time, a few weeks later, after losing the baby, I was feeling especially despondent. And I was just really desperate. I was with hope for several reasons. And I just had a lot of questions about why this had happened. And I was really questioning even my relationship with the Lord. And, was I just not strong enough? And what was I doing wrong? And why did this happen? And but God knew that my desperation needed to be redirected. And so one morning I was sitting in this beautiful mountain ski lodge, and I ordered some coffee. I sat down with my Bible, and I just remember feeling so lost. I had no idea what I should read, where I should turn to. But my friend Cindy said, you just need to be in the Word this morning. And so there I was. And I just kind of stumbled on 1 Samuel. And I'm sure that I had read it before, but, you know, as a single person, you kind of read those stories differently than, especially than I did that day. But that day I read it with new eyes and thankfully with an open heart. And so I was first intrigued by the way that Hannah prayed. And Alan talked about this a little bit, but Hannah was so humble and in that she didn't care who saw her pray, what she looked like as she prayed, and kind of what I've always pictured is that ugly cry that we women do, especially, and it's usually over something that did or didn't happen. It's about something that, you know, was or was not said, but it's always about whatever happened that was not the way that we imagined it being. And so I agree with Helen in that, like the father in the story of the prodigal son, Hannah she wasn't afraid to make a fool of herself and pray. But I started asking God that day if it was okay for me to pray that way. Was it really okay to cry out for my child that way, and or even to be bold enough to pray that we would have another child. And our doctor had said that we could, but I had a hard time believing that at this time. And so, didn't cry till I looked at you.
She always cries. You always cry when you look at me.
But I really almost audibly heard God say, yes, I want you to cry. I want you to pray that way. I want you to cry. I want you to grieve. And so that was the day that I really began to know that God wanted to know my heart. And he didn't want to know my heart only about this, but he wanted to know me. And so Psalm 37 says, delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. And there's a lot that can be said about how God changes our hearts so that our desires will be his desires. But that day I really learned how to petition the Lord through this passage in 1 Samuel. And so, secondly, it struck me that Hannah had been beat down for many years by her rival, Peninnah. We don't see Hannah complaining, retaliating, as Alan said. We don't see her trying to manipulate the circumstances as we do in many other places in the Old Testament. We just see her praying. And that makes me think of Exodus 14:14, which is a verse that has become important for my girls and I in the last couple of years. And it says, the Lord will fight for you. You have only to be silent. And so when Hannah had no words and only her mouth was moving, I really believe that God was just fighting for her, and he was helping her to have the grace to even voice the prayer that she wanted to pray. And so in verse 15, we see her pouring out her heart. In verse 17, we see her asking the priests not to consider her a worthless woman. I'm sorry, y'all. She had had enough of that kind of talk from Peninnah. And, you know, that day sitting in that lodge, I felt like a worthless woman. As I sat there reading that passage, I just couldn't see that, you know, I could be someone who could rise above this and that God could really bless me. But, and I didn't even have a rival wife like Hannah did. I'm pretty glad about that. But I did have all of these thoughts in my head, and I was pretty beat down by those thoughts. And there were things like, you don't deserve a child. You don't know God well enough to even know what he wants for you. After how you've lived your life, how could you be a mother? And is this punishment? And would I even be a good mom anyway? And I think probably for most women, even if you're not a mom, we've all heard those voices in our head telling us that we are not worthy of something that that we are petitioning God for. And men, I venture to say that you've had those thoughts too. And so it took me years to really get those kinds of distractions out of my head. And honestly, sometimes there are other things that can drag me down in the same way. But that's why we all long for heaven. In heaven, we'll have peace always. And so in verse 17, Eli the priest said to Hannah, "Go in peace." And we know that Hannah went away and her face was no longer sad. And Hannah knew in her spirit that God would answer her prayer. And that day in that lodge, I knew in my spirit that God would answer my prayer too. The third point that really hits me now, after all of these years, 32 and a half years, I guess, is that Hannah fulfilled her promise to give her child back to God. And she literally took him, she packed up his little robe, and she took him to Eli, and she left him there. And as a mom, I can't imagine that. I remember how hard it was leaving our first child at college. And I was happy for him, and it was time for that, but it was hard to do that. And, I can't imagine packing up a maybe 3-year-old and leaving him. But, if you think about it, if you are a mom, how many times over the years have you had to give your child to God again? And how many times, if your child is little right now, how many times will you have to? If you hope to be a mom, you can count on many, many, many times that you have to pray and you have to lay it down and you have to give that child to God again. But we know that everything that we have is from the Lord, and we know that He loves us. He loves our children with the most pure and perfect love there ever was. And Mary is such an example of being willing to give her son. She never saw her son again on this earth, but we know that she saw him in heaven. And so, again, that part of this passage just helped me through the years remember that my children are not my own, and that what I really want for them is for them to belong to the Lord. And so I'm glad they do. So then in chapter 2, chapter 2 contains a beautiful poem written by Hannah, and it starts with this. It says, "My heart exults in the Lord, my horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth derides my enemies, because I rejoice in your salvation." Hannah's no longer talking about her rival Peninnah there. She's writing about the enemies of the Lord, and I just encourage you to go and read the rest of that poem. Hannah learns more about how to pray and how to gather strength from the Lord. And it's a reminder that our struggle is not against flesh and blood. Our struggle is not against our children, when they're toddlers and when they're teenagers and when they're adults and we don't agree. But our struggle is against the enemy who would seek to destroy them. And so we know the ultimate victor. How did God answer my prayer or our prayer? That same couple later in the next few months hosted a couples shower for us because we were expecting our first child, and we had a son, and then the Lord granted us 2 more daughters after that. And so I would say, don't give up. Pray for your children, your future children, your children's children, your grandchildren, and pray for your spiritual children. Be humble, follow through on what you promised God, and then delight in what God does.
Well, I'm glad that you said what you said about chapter 2 and about Hannah's prayer there in chapter 2, because Bible scholars tell us that this prayer becomes the model for much of what Elizabeth is going to pray in the Gospels when she offers up what's known as when she offers up her prayer of praise to God for what He's doing, and finally allowing her and Zacharias to have a child after years of being barren. And there's also this whole idea of the modeling of Samuel and the fact that he had been a Nazirite and how that played into some of the descriptions that were given in the New Testament about John the Baptist and his strange lifestyle, even though he was never called a Nazirite, how he lived like one. But I just want to close the sermon out today by saying this, and Kara's touched on it, and we've touched on it here in chapter 2, and you can read in the Gospels and see the connection, and that is, moms, and I'm going to say dads too, as you're thinking about how you're raising your children, no matter how old they are, or even if you don't have any yet, think about what it means to raise your children in the light of the gospel. God has a story for your child. He has a story. He has a role for your child to play. He has a purpose for your child's life. And we just want to encourage you to think about 3 things when you're raising your children. I'm going to share these three things with you, and then we're going to have a closing prayer. First of all, to remember that you're raising an adult and not a child. Your child will grow up. But what you're doing is you're shaping young adults, you're shaping men and women who one day will be parents and grandparents and great-grandparents themselves, even long after you're gone. So you want to raise your children to be an adult, not a child. Secondly, you want to raise your children in such a way that they will treasure Christ more than they treasure you. Your goal is not to keep them around you for all the remaining days of your life. Your goal is to cause them to love Jesus passionately and to follow him wherever it is that he may lead. And then, here I'll cry, because we have seen this in our family. You're raising your children to be adults who will one day come back to their mother and say, thank you. Thank you for raising me the way that you did. God bless Anna. God bless Elkanah. God, we love you just for the way in which you use our dire circumstances to draw us to prayer. And you give us the ability to pray great, big, bold prayers. Let me close with this prayer that was written a couple of hundred years ago by a Puritan pastor by the name of Philip Doddridge. You can close your eyes or you can stare at your screen, whichever one you wish to do at this time. And the prayer says this: Lord, may you answer our united prayers with peace. Pour out your Spirit on our families and your blessing on our children, that they may grow up before you as willow trees by the river, that they may be a comfort to their parents, a support to their church, and a name and a praise to you. Amen.